Let's take a look at the chain and trim feature that we have in QBOT V3. The chain and trim feature addresses maybe a problem, you could call it a problem, I guess, that we as automated quilters or robotic quilters, computerized quilters, we face this just about every day. Say you have a design that you've downloaded or even a design that came with the QBOT V3 and you need to fit it into a space on your quilt. Well, the chances of the design being the same exact dimensions as the area on your quilt is pretty minimal. So all of the designs have to be resized to some extent. And a lot of the edge-to-edge designs, what we'll find is that either they're too tall and not long enough, or they're too long and too short. If we fit in the design as it came to us, as the designer designed it, it would hit a boundary before, either the length boundary or the vertical boundary before it was filled to fill the whole space that we want to quilt into. So what we've done in QBOT V3 is incorporate a feature called chain and trim. And I'll show it to you right now, and I think probably the best way is to go through this scenario, we'll call it a quilting scenario, and see how it comes into use. We're going to use the GT0010 design, which is just a meander. It's nice because it doesn't take a lot of time to quilt out. And it's fairly short. I believe the overall design is either a foot or maybe 15 inches long. So it's a very short segment. But a lot of edge-to-edge designs come that way, just as segments. So let's get to it. And you can see through my needle cam, I've got a piece of fabric that I've laid out on my frame, and what I've done is I put these pieces of paper to represent the batting. And normally, if this were the batting, you'd have a little bit of backing off to this side. Well, all of my fabric for this demonstration, it's all basically the same size, so I had to make something up to give the illusion of what the batting would look like. And if you look at the other side, I also have this on the other side. So I'm going to choose my area, and I'm only going to do 4 points because it's just a blank piece of fabric. It's a blank canvas. Now, when I do edge-to-edge, I like to have my edge-to-edge go completely off the quilt. Otherwise, it's more of a border design if everything stays within the boundary of the top fabric. Edge-to-edge, the way I do them, they go completely off the quilt. So they start sewing off maybe 1/4 of an inch in the batting, they go across the complete quilt top, and off to the batting and backing on the other side. So when it's all trimmed, the design, you don't see the beginning and ending point of the stitching. It's basically in the binding of the quilt. So that's what I'm going to show here on this example. So I'm going to choose my points. I go into pattern quilting and I set a point, and then I move down, and I'm just going to do 4 points. Nothing really particular here, but I am going to start and stop in the batting area, and I'll do something that's maybe 4 inches tall, something like a little bit around 4 inches tall. And let's see here. Boom. Okay, we'll set that point and I'll say done. I was a little bit off on the left edge, as you can see, but that's okay. We're not going to worry about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to choose my GTEE design. So just going to scroll through it here. And there it is. And it's going to place it in that area. And as you can see, QBOT's working fine. The design has been elongated. The routine that QBOT uses is it takes the original design and either stretches it uniformly or proportionally to either fill the space, and when it hits a boundary, whether it's the top and bottom or the length, it will then stop scaling at that point. So it has done a proportional scale on it, and for this particular design, it hits the top and bottom boundary first, and then it stops. And what you see on the screen is what you end up with. Well, great, but that's not really what I want. But I don't want to stretch the design out. I don't want to make it look artificial. I don't want to change the proportion. So what I do is I click the chain and trim button. And what that automatically does is it chains the design together and then trims it to the boundary. And it starts, what it does, what the algorithm is to shift the design as it was originally sized over to the left until it hits the left-hand boundary. Then it takes the original design and then chains it, so it links the beginning point of the next one to the end point of the first one, and it links them until it hits the right-hand boundary. When it hits the right-hand boundary or goes beyond the right-hand boundary, then it cuts it off. It just trims it right there. And that's what we see on the screen. You can see here, right in here, it has trimmed the design. Now, because this is a design that I know nests without any offset, I want to save this design because I'm going to do this and then repeat underneath and repeat underneath. So I'm going to save this pattern, and I'm just going to call it EE and space tutorial. And then it's saved that. But I do want to quilt it out, so I'm going to press move to start. Pull up my bobbin thread, and if this were a real quilt, this white, instead of being paper, this would be my batting. And then I'm going to press go. There you go. And as you can see with the chain and trim feature, when we got to the end there, you can see that it was going along the path of the design. Then it hit the right-hand edge, but if it just hit the right-hand edge and stopped, it wouldn't have captured another part of the design that was still within the chosen area. So it drew a vertical line and then along the boundary that we chose, and it then reconnected the part that was in the boundary, and it so basically quilts along, hits a wall, and then moves up or down to catch up with the next piece of quilting or next piece of the design that needs to be quilted to finish it out so that the interior is filled nicely. Now we've done the first row on this, and we want to nest the next one. So we've kind of covered this in another video, but I'll just do it again for reinforcement. But we don't need to sew it out. But for the alignment for the next row, it's always nice to reinforce how we do that, because edge to edge is part of, or can be a big part of how we quilt. Because we have saved the pattern, which is good. So had we accidentally hit exit at this point, we could recapture everything that we need to do to nest up the next row. And that was covered in a separate video. But let's just do it correctly here. We press overlay, then modify. We double tap the X box, do a double tap in that box, and that locks us from being able to move the design to the right or to the left. Then we just use our finger or the down arrow, and we move the design down. And if we have to fine tune it a little bit, you can use the arrow to fine tune the placement. And what you're looking for in any nesting type of design, you're looking for it to be properly spaced so it doesn't obviously look like a banded quilting design. And so if we were going to quilt this out, we would just go ahead and quilt it out just like it is. But we're not going to. We're going to move on to the next segment. And let me get out of here. Yes. We're going to go on to the next segment where I discuss, well, what if the design we have or the design we downloaded is too long? Great. If it's too short and it expands to the correct height, that's great. But what if it's too long for the area, and when we place it originally, it fits it in and it's just this little narrow band, even though we know it can place correctly and we just need to trim it. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go into pattern quilting and we'll choose an area and we'll choose it again just underneath here. We'll do a very similar procedure. We'll set some points. I'm not going to quilt this one out. I'm just going to show you on the tablet all of the steps to go through. Say done. There's our area. We'll go into edge-to-edge borders again, and let me use the edge-to-edge GTEE 001 series, but let me choose the GTEE 0013, which is a long one. So we click that, it sizes it, and you can see that it has placed the design and then stretched it right until it met one of the boundaries. And in this case, it met the right and left boundary, and it doesn't fill the height that we need. Super simple. We go to fix this. It's super simple. Modify. Then what we do is we double tap the scale Y button. So this button right here, we're going to double tap it. And it's automatically scaled it to the height. Now it's also scaled it proportionally, and it's way too long now. So if you went to quilt it at this point, it would start way off to the left and end way off to the right. But that's okay. We just say done. Okay? And it goes back to this screen. Well, now we say chain and trim. We chain it and trim it, and automatically it shifts it so that the left hand of the design matches the left hand boundary, and at the right hand of the design it trims it off. So right there is our design, very similar to our first one. Well, it should be, if I chose the area correctly, meaning if I chose the identical area I chose before in the first part of this tutorial, the design would look identical and quilt out identically. Okay? So it doesn't matter if your design is too short or too long. You can get there to the end result that you'd like with QBOT V3 using the chain and trim feature. Now, there's another scenario that you can run across, and I'm going to say there's probably 5 different scenarios. Some of you might say, well, there's probably a dozen more. But another scenario that you can come across is your nesting design is an offset design. It's not as simple as locking that X value and just pulling down the design in a simple overlay and then modify kind of routine that we just did. Well, we can still do it though in QBOT V3. We just have to think maybe 2 steps ahead. So let's pretend, better yet, let's not pretend. Let's choose an area, and we're going to use the chain and trim command with a design that requires an offset. So I'm back here, I'm going to select some points, and I'm going to be careful here when I'm selecting my area. I'm going to go off the edge as if I'm starting off in the batting and backing only without the top. I'll set a point, and I'm going to be careful to make sure my upper line, all my lines are parallel, or as parallel as I can be. So I'll just double check to make sure that delta Y is 0, and I'm going to just pick a point that's also in the white over on the right hand side. And I'll set a point, and I'll do something that's about 4 inches tall or 4 inches high again. Right there, that's probably pretty good, and then come back and do my finishing point over here on the left hand side. And I'm also making sure my delta Y is pretty much 0, if I can get it. Say done, and the design I'm going to put in here is an edge-to-edge. That is GTEE 003 something, I believe. Still in the borders, to edge. Here we go. And I'm going to choose 031. I believe that's a pretty good one. It's a little bit longer. You can see that the design is longer than the area that I chose, so it didn't go to the full height when it did its proportional scaling up. So I'm going to modify this, and also this design, it's called a button flower design, and the flowers, the way it's supposed to work is that the next row, if the first row has flower, 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 the next row, the flower is in between the two upper flowers, okay? That will make sense probably when I do the second row, but it has to be shifted over about one flower spacing, or half of a flower spacing for the next row. I'm going to modify this though, because the first row needs to be longer than what is on the quilt, so that I can have something to shift for my second row. Now when I do my second row, I will trim it to the edges, and then I can save that as like row 2. I'll give it a file name, row 2. Then when I have to do the third row, which is the same as the first row, or odd number rows, I'll bring in that first row again, which will overhang, but when I do it for the third time, I can trim that right hand edge. Then from then on down the quilt, say this is a full-size bed quilt and it has multiple rows, then I can alternate between row 1, which is trimmed, and row 2, which is trimmed. But the first row 1, we can't trim because we need it to make row 2. Now, you can also do all of this in software, but for those of you who don't like pulling out the software and doing this, you can just do it here on the QBOT, but you have to think just a little bit ahead. Well, I want to scale this bigger, and hopefully I can get a full section more off of this. So I'm going to double tap the scale Y, and I'm going to slide it over to the right, and it looks like, I'll let it redraw, it looks like I get what I need to make that second row complete, which is great. So I'm going to move this over again and align it to my left side and my top and bottom, and that looks good. I'm not going to trim it, I'm just going to quilt it, and when it gets to the right hand edge or into the batting, I'm not going to let it continue to quilt off into the air. What I'm going to do is press pause, then do a % restart to 100%, which will advance it to the end of the design. Finish out the quilting. It might take one stitch in the air and then say done. Then I'm going to save the design for future use. Then I'm going to hit overlay, modify, go down, and use the trim function to make the second row. So let's get started with this. I'm ready to go. I'll press done and then move to start, and we'll quilt out this first row. Now we're getting into the section where it's going to be going off into the batting. And when you're doing this, and when you're quilting in real life, when this happens, be very careful so that the hopping foot does not get up underneath the top of the, and then hook itself and then loop a thread around the foot, and that can cause all kinds of issues. So we're going to let that quilt around. We're now officially in the batting, and we're about to go off. So we press pause, and what we do now is a % restart. Okay, and we're going to do a 100% restart. 100%. Okay. Move to restart position. And it's going to go way off to the right of the quilt here. I'll just trim my threads. And I will say go. It'll take a stitch probably, and then you might want to unthread your needle just to make sure that it doesn't get wrapped around the bobbin case. I press go, took a thread, and then we're done. Now I'm going to save this pattern at this point, and I'm going to call it row, let's see, row 1 tutorial, and say OK. Okay, now here's where the fun part begins, and I actually do mean it's going to be fun. I'm not being facetious. So we do overlay, modify, and I'm going to just use my finger to move it down, move the design down. And I'm also, you can see that if I try to do that right underneath, it doesn't look right at all. It looks totally incorrect. That's not the way we would want that to nest. So what I do is I need to shift it over and put that flower right in between the other two, and I move it down just a bit. Now here's where it gets really fun. You can see a button there next to the magnifying glass. The magnifying glass is there and it says off, and the color is blue on that button, and right next to it is a button that is also blue, but its name is trim. And right now when it's blue it says trim and off. So the trim function is off. Press that button and we get a dialog box that says turning trim function on. Great. Now what boundaries do we want to trim it to? We want to trim this to the left-hand boundary and the right-hand boundary. So I click left here and right, and I say OK. Now, you'll notice right now on the screen it doesn't show what that trim function has done. And the reason for that is that from a programming point of view, if you wanted to undo that trim function, once we make the trim, I should start out by saying once we make the trim, it really is trimming it and changing the design forever. There's really no undo for that. So while we're in the modify screen, at this point I could say, hit the button, say trim, and turn trim back off, and I'd be back to the beginning. Once we press done, however, the trim function actually performs the trim and changes the design forever. So make sure that everything looks right before you press that done button. And it looks good to me. I like the spacing. It might be a little bit tight. I'll just nudge it just a little bit. I like that right there. I press done. It's doing the trim now, and it trims the left hand and right hand boundary to that new size. Now, this we're going to save in the future. After it sews it out, we're going to save it as row 2. Right now, though, we do have to sew it out, so we're going to do that right now. And then when it's done, we'll save it as row 2 tutorial. Move to the start point. Pull up our bobbin thread and then press go. And you notice when it hits that left-hand edge, it hits the edge like it's hitting a wall and just makes a straight line to pick up the design and then continue marching along to the right. Okay, we're getting to the end here, and I'm holding down my piece of paper. Now, when you're quilting, you will have to make sure that that hopping foot does not get underneath your quilt top, just like I'm trying to make sure that that hopping foot doesn't get underneath my little piece of paper there. And it looks like I'm successful. Now, on the right-hand boundary, you can see with the trim function, it's going to trim right to that vertical boundary. Just like this, it goes straight down until it needs to fill in whatever part of the design is required in the area. And then when it's finished, it will then end like it ends any other pattern. So we've ended this pattern, and now before we are tempted to hit that exit button and say, great, we got our 2 rows, remember we have to save that pattern as row 2. So I'm going to save this pattern. I'm going to call it row space 2 space tutorial. Say OK. And now we can say exit. So we say exit. Now when it comes to time to do the next row, we will choose our boundary, and remember, now that we've done, and depending on your throat space, we don't have to choose just a boundary for a single row. We could choose a larger boundary for maybe 2 or 3 rows, depending on if you had to advance the quilt at this point or not, and depending on the throat space of your machine. I have room to do probably 1 more, so I'm going to get this process started. And it goes back to, in the process, I've covered in another video, which is probably picking up where you left off, or maybe doing nesting edge to edge, how to do that row once you're starting from scratch. How do you get it nested? Well, recall that all you have to do is choose your upper boundary and choose points that make sense for you to align the design that you're going to input or import. You just have to choose some points in the upper boundary of your design to act as a guideline. So I'm going to use my needle here and make sure that I capture some good points. I'll set that point. And these cusps here are good. And I'm going to grab the curvature too of this. So I'll set a point, set point, and I just go through quickly. You want to be accurate enough because you don't want to go too fast and then lose your accuracy for placing the pattern, and you don't want to go so slow that this becomes overly tedious. But considering how hard it is to pull out stitches, it's better to take a little bit of time and do this nicely. Make sure I get that point. And I think that's probably good. I'm going to go over, grab my right hand edge, right about there. I'm going to come down the 4 inches or so, maybe a little bit more than 4 inches, 4.5, and then come back over. I've got free license to choose my points. When you're actually doing a quilt, you might have some things that, oh, I need to go back. I forgot to choose that last point, set point, and then say done. And it's a little bit of a wonky boundary, but that is absolutely okay. So now I'm going to go to all my designs, and I'm going to search for tutorial. And I see row 1. That's the design I want to put in there. And I need to modify this and tap in 100% so that everything looks better there. And now you can see here is it aligned to the previous row. Let me just get it over. Let's see. There it is aligned to the previous row, which was the offset row. So I need to make sure that I move that properly, and I believe this is the correct offset. Just like that. I think I like that placement. Now, because this is the third row, and I can use the trim function on the third row. I couldn't do it on the first because I had to use that as we call it the seed. I had to use it as the seed for the next row. But once I save that second row, I'm free to alter my first row. So I'm going to turn my trim on, and I'm going to trim it to the right, and I'm going to say OK. And I'm going to say done. And it automatically trims it to the right-hand boundary. And I'm going to save this pattern as row 1 trimmed. And then I can move to the start point. Press go and quilt this out. Okay, we're to the right-hand boundary again, and as you can see, when it hits that boundary, it's as if it hits a wall and moves vertically up, yet it still fills in the space that's on the, well, in this case, it's in our fake batting, but this could also be close to the edge of your quilt. And what it does is it allows you to finish off the design without having to quilt in space or add fabric to the sides or use all of the props that you may have had to use in the past.